Working Man Investor. Today's video is President Trump going to appoint a shadow Fed. Federal Reserve President Jerome Powell's term is up May of 2026. Normally, the President of the United States will wait to appoint his replacement until about February or March of that year. However, President Trump has talked about appointing somebody sooner. This has led some to believe that the purpose would be to undermine Jerome Powell. One of the things that will be telling if this is what the president is planning to do is who he nominates. If he nominates somebody who is already in the Federal Reserve, then those individuals will be forced to abide by the Fed blackout period where they can't talk about monetary policy. However, if he nominates somebody outside of the Federal Reserve, they'll be free to go on all the media platforms and basically armchair quarterback every decision that Powell and the Federal Reserve makes 24/7 up until May when Jerome Powell's term is up. This would in turn make Jerome Powell's job stressful and just possibly be something he doesn't want to deal with, which could lead to him resigning and then Trump getting his wish of replacing him earlier like he wants. So why does Trump want to replace Jerome Powell so bad? President Trump wants interest rates cut, and only the Federal Reserve has that ability. Trump has been quoted as saying that cutting the Federal Reserve rates would be like a jet fuel to the economy. Lower interest rates, what they do is they encourage people to borrow and businesses to borrow, and one person's borrowing and spending is another person's income. So when people spend, businesses can produce more. So if you got a lot of people taking out loans and going out and buying things like cars or starting a business, or businesses taking loans and adding second shifts or building a warehouse, this all creates jobs. And then what happens when you create jobs is you expand the tax revenue. You have more people working, you have more income tax. So this is part of the reason why President Trump wants interest rates cut so bad. However, for the Fed to reserve to the lower rates, they must have a majority vote. A lot of people don't realize this. The Federal Reserve is made up of the FMOC, Federal Open Market Committee. What that is, they meet 8 times a year and they vote on whether or not to raise or lower the Fed funds rate. And it's majority rule. So they need about 7 votes. They need 7 votes as a minimum to raise or cut rates. Jerome Powell by himself or whoever the Fed chairman is only one of the 12 votes. So replacing Powell on his own doesn't guarantee that the Fed funds rate is going to be cut. A lot of people don't understand this. I've talked to a lot of people that seem to think that it's all on Jay Powell. It's not. Now, could a new Fed chairman who wants to cut rates be more of an influence to them doing so? Sure. Could he go around behind closed doors and try to convince his fellow Fed up people to cut rates? Yeah, he can. But ultimately, they get to vote the way that they feel necessary. And the way the Federal Reserve is supposed to vote is by their dual mandate. Low unemployment and minimal inflation of about 2% and a good solid employment numbers. So that's what's supposed to drive the decision to cut rates, not politics. The Fed is supposed to be separate. So, like I said, they're supposed to cut rates off of solid economic data. What's dangerous about the situation here is the bond market. If he puts in a shadow Fed or somebody that the bond market considers to be a puppet of Trump that's just going to keep pushing for rate cuts because that's what Trump wants, the bond market could reject that, meaning that what happens is interest rates on bonds will go up. The bond market dictates a lot in the financial world. Everybody watches the bond market. So what do I mean by that? Treasuries are our bonds, and it's the way that we finance our debt. We put them up to auction, and then people bid on them, and that's how we finance our debt. If people feel like the Federal Reserve is not making monetary policy off of solid economic data and off of what the president wants, off of politics, what happens is they won't bid on our bonds because they won't view it as a good investment. When they don't bid on the bonds, the interest rate goes up and the price of the bond gets cheaper. They drive the interest rate up. They want a bigger interest rate because of the risks that they're taking by, in their opinion, the Federal Reserve acting on politics, not solid economic data. So also, even if the Fed does lower the Fed funds rate, that doesn't necessarily mean Treasury yields are going to fall. Treasury yield is nothing more than the interest rate. Trump wants a low Treasury rate, especially on the 10-year, 20-year, and 30-year Treasury rate, because we're $37 trillion in debt, and this year we have $9 trillion coming up to be re-auctioned off and refinanced. So he doesn't want 4.5%, 5% Treasury rates. He wants 4, as low as he can get it, because then our debt service is cheaper. So it's the same as your mortgage rate right on your house, okay? You buy a house, say your interest rate is 8%, your mortgage is going to be more expensive. Your payment's going to be more expensive, and the cost over the 30 years is going to be more expensive than if your interest rate was, say, 2%. The same way with treasuries. The more the interest rate is on our 10, 20, and 30-year note, the more it costs us to finance our debt. And at this time, it costs us about $580 billion a year just to pay interest on our treasuries. That's our second biggest deficit, next behind, I believe it's Social Security. So this is why Trump wants interest rates to go down, but it's a misnomer that if the Fed just cuts the Fed funds rates, when all the Fed funds rate is, it's the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans to meet cash reserve requirements. And it does affect credit card debt, car loans, some business loans. It does that, but it does not really affect the 10, 20, 30, that longer term debt. So even if they lower the interest rate, the Fed fund rate, it affects, like I said, short-term debt. Now that doesn't storm T-bills, okay, which are treasuries. They usually are 30 to 90 to 2 years. That's short-term debt. And its Fed funds rate has more of an effect on that because it's short-term debt, but not on the 10, 20, 30 years. So when the Fed funds rate falls, the short-term treasury yields tend to decline. When long-term treasury yields are influenced by the Fed funds rate, but also by other factors like inflation expectations, economic growth, and supply and demand. The supply and demand is how many people are at our auctions bidding on the bill. And again, we're $37 trillion in debt. We're to the point now where other countries, because other countries will come to our auctions, individual investors, businesses, foreign and domestic. When you start sitting $37 trillion in debt, you're viewed as more likely to start paying that off by printing money, by inflating the dollar. So you're still paying the debt, but you're paying off dollars with dollars that have less buying power. Okay, so that is why a lot of these investors are starting to demand a higher interest rate. A higher interest rate starts to protect us. So it's the economic growth is what President Trump is going for. Now, this is another reason why President Trump wants the interest rates cut so it can be like jet fuel for the economy. The goal of the big, beautiful bill is to lower the deficit. And the way to do that is one of the ways that is through growth, growing the economy, okay? You put more people to work, more people are working. One of the reasons why he's going after them and supposedly going to go after Medicaid is to try to get people that are able-bodied back to work, because then they can tax them. They can make more revenue. The government can only get money 2 ways: taxes and tariffs, okay? And that's the way we pay our debt back. So you put more people to work, you grow and expand the economy, then in theory you can pay off your debt. The other way to do it is through cutting government spending, which they've done some, and raising taxes, which they don't want to do. When you cut government spending and you raise taxes, you're almost guaranteed a recession. When you can pay off a deficit through growing the economy, that's the best way to do it, because the economy booms and more people are prospering. People are doing better. So that's the goal. That's why he's pushing for lower interest rates. I just wanted to clear up some misnomers I've heard. It takes a majority of the 12 voting members to lower or raise interest rates, and whoever the chairman is, whether it's Jerome Powell or somebody, when somebody replaces him, they're only one of 12 votes. So the chairman for the Fed alone is not going to be able to change interest rates by himself. He can campaign for it, he can push for it, but he can't do it alone. He needs other voting members. And then I want you to understand that when you cut the Fed funds rates, the longer term debt, the 10, 20, 30-year treasuries, are not as affected as much as the short-term debt. So that's what I got for you today. Working man investor, keep grinding, people.